Hello everyone and welcome to another Arcane Mage video. In this video I'm going to continue my series where I go over some of the Shadowlands changes that are coming to Arcane Mages. And today I'd like to dive a little bit into some of the mechanical changes that I was speculating about in my last video. We have a bit more information now from Blizzard, and we have it here in front of us at Wowhead, so if you'd like to check out where I'm getting my information, you can go there. We're going to look for just a few minutes but add both the class ability changes and also some of the Shadowlands Covenant abilities, which have been updated since our last video, and I'm going to talk just about some of my thoughts on what this means for Arcane and how we can think about the class going forward. So we'll begin, mostly I'm not going to talk about numbers because numbers are subject to change, mostly just about the mechanical changes. The first big one on the list is that Arcane Barrage is being granted 2% of your max mana per arcane charge spent, which means if you're at 4 arcane charges and you use Arcane Barrage, you will get 8% of your maximum mana back. This is significant because it helps Arcane to stay above the certain thresholds of mana. It makes it so that we can dip a little bit below the 70 percentile with our Arcane Blast usage, and still trust that using Arcane Barrage is going to help us get back into that window. So the way that Blizzard seems to be envisioning the flavor of Arcane is they want to double down on the mana within a specific window playstyle. So the Mastery Savant is going to be a highlighted element of Shadowlands Arcane Mage play. So they've added a number of new tools to help Arcane Mages stay in those high ranges of percentages of mana, and we'll see that Barrage is part of that now. It's a good thing because outside of changes like this, Arcane is really fighting to get out of a very static rotation, which means you have your burst portion, and then after you evocate back up, you really tend to only do a few things. You cast Arcane Blast about 3 or 4 times depending on the procs you get, and then you spend those 4 charges with Arcane Barrage, and that's generally speaking what gives Arcane some of its meme flavor. There's very little iteration or changes in gameplay. Sometimes you get an Arcane Missiles proc through clear casting, and so you weave that in, and as I've tried to show in some of my other videos, the conservation phase is actually a place where you can easily screw things up, and maximizing your damage has a lot to do with making sure that you are in those high percentage ranges during that phase. But what Blizzard is suggesting for Shadowlands is that Arcane needs a few more tools to help them deal with that. So Arcane Barrage is on the list. I'm going to skip over all this stuff for now. We're going to look at the next major interesting piece, which is that Arcane Power is getting a duration increase by 5 seconds. So currently, as you see here, Arcane Power is set at 10 seconds. So you press the button and you immediately have 10 seconds of the buff window. And this cooldown is being changed from 1.5 minute cooldown to a 3-minute cooldown. So Arcane Power is now going to be a 15-second CD, which means quite a lot, actually. It means, for instance, that our burst window is going to be longer, potentially, if we take the route of packing in all of our CDs into this portion. 15 seconds is quite a long time for Arcane to be hitting with high-value Arcane Blasts on a target. So it's essentially like another 4 casts, potentially, of Arcane Blast within that window. So that's interesting. But the other massive thing is that 5 seconds increase allows you to stack other abilities, and we'll see that with the Shadowlands Covenant abilities, into that window without losing some of the potency of the Arcane Power. So one of the recurring problems for Arcane Mages is that if you have to move at all in BFA, in raids, during your burst windows, if you have to sacrifice at all any second of Arcane Power, you lose out on a substantial amount of your overall damage in a fight. And even though it comes back every 1.5 minutes, you find that maximizing your efficiency in that rotation and making sure every single blast hits with Arcane Power up, it can be frustrating. So they're giving a little bit more leeway, and perhaps we will feel the same kind of pressure once things end up coming down. So that what I mean by that is it'll just end up being that stacking all of these things, the Covenant abilities, your Rune of Power, any other buffs that the game might come out, or essences that touch the Magi, as we'll see in a minute. That's actually just the best way to go, and the 15 seconds will really feel like our 10-second window. In any case, that's the major change happening here, and I think it's interesting. But perhaps more significant is this little one here, cooldown change from 1.5 minutes to 3 minutes. I'm not sure how I feel about this. It is a massive alteration of what Arcane currently in BFA is all about, which is these short moments of glory that recur a lot more frequently than its counterparts. So Frost Mage has a 3-minute cooldown, Fire Mage has a 2-minute CD in Combustion and Icy Veins, respectively. And Arcane has always kind of sat in this weird window of being 1.5 minutes. So it lined up with a lot of 1.5 minute trinkets, for example, and maybe they're trying to get away from some of that, so that not every single Arcane Power is tied to those trinkets. And perhaps they're just finding that it's really difficult to balance that final tier of talents between Arcane Orb, the Overpowered, and the Time Warp one. I think it's probably a good change overall. It means that more of Arcane's gameplay and damage will happen outside of the Arcane Power burst window, and therefore, hopefully, they will buff it, and making and managing your mana at those high thresholds for the whole encounter, not just for that important burst window, becomes a significant element. So I think on the whole, it's a good thing that they're moving to 3 minutes. Obviously, in terms of how this turns out for damage, nobody really knows, but I'm anticipating that some of the tools they're giving us mean that we'll have a chance to still pump out lots of damage, and perhaps make use of other talents that have lay dead, because it's just so much damage goes into this Arcane Power window that you must have everything stacked together. Clear casting is giving us 2 stacks instead of 1. I think we covered this in the last video, but I'll just say briefly that this is a good change because it gives us some flexibility for managing mana. It means that if you're in a burst window and you get a proc of arcane missiles through clear casting, you don't necessarily have to use it up right away because it'll go to waste. You can let it stack. So a good change. Again, conjure mana gem, likewise, a good change, helping give you an actual tool you can use to increase your mana, restoring it, keeping you in those special windows. Presence of Mind giving Arcane Blast an additional instant cast, so that's 3 instead of 2, is pretty significant. It kind of plays into that longer burst window in Arcane Power, but also I think just in general, this might be one of the ways that Blizzard is trying to address in a longer fight movement issues for Arcane. Generally speaking, we would always hold Presence of Mind for our burst window, because every 1.5 minutes it comes up. We want to be able to cast the last couple of Arcane blasts at the very end of our Arcane Power, making sure that we get those in on instant cast. But since the window is going to be a 3-minute cooldown instead of 1.5, you'll probably find that we can start to save Presence of Mind for our movement. And since we have a few more tools to manage our mana, what we'll end up doing probably is for half of the time using Presence of Mind when we need to move somewhere, instead of using, I don't know, other utility abilities like Prismatic Barrier, or maybe weaving them together. And then for the other half of the time, making sure we have Presence of Mind up for our Arcane Power burst windows. So a good change overall, a bit more flexibility. I think that's excellent. Touch the Magi, coming off as a talent, going into a on-use. What I didn't know from our last video is that whether this would be an on-use or just something passive that happens, and it looks like it's going to be an ability we get. It has a 1.5 second cast time, apparently, but this is something that we can stack into any burst window in single target or AoE, and I think it's kind of powerful. If you think about how long this this lasts for 8 seconds, is a long time in a 15-second Arcane Power burst window to do a ton of damage. So think about it. If you do 1 million damage in that window, you're suddenly doing 1.5 million to that target. And you're going to explode for that 500,000 damage to every target. I guess they're going to reduce the damage that happens in AoE. I'm not sure if they'll cap it. There's been some discussions on whether the AoE damage portion of things like Touch the Magi or Combustion will spread only to certain numbers of mobs. That might be a good thing, to be honest, because you see some things with like Unholy Decays and Fire Mages where their mastery or their ignites or their explosions just scale far beyond what other classes can produce. Anyway, so Touch the Magi, really good, probably even just for single target. Just something to look out for, another ability to stack. Think about this as a kind of buff to your damage that you must have up with your burst window. And at 45 seconds, this means we'll have also times where we're using it a few times outside of our burst window. So a couple times each, and then we have one for the big bang. Amplification is getting a buff, and this is fascinating in my opinion because not only in PvP is Arcane Missiles the go-to ability that we fill with when we're fighting, but it also does a crap ton of damage through certain talents, giving another missile on top when clear cast. That's in addition, of course, to one missile that we're gaining, I believe. Oh, I passed it. We're gaining through clear casting here. So we get one other missile through clear casting here, and then if we take this talent, we're getting another 2. So that's potentially 3 arcane missiles coming out of Amplification. I think this is a really needed change. Arcane missiles has never felt good to press in PvE encounters, and so you just feel bad when a spec that is already hamstrung by having a perception of being a one-button build or one-button spec actually really is just a one-button spec. That is to say, Arcane Missiles has no serious value in the eyes of the player except for a moment to regenerate some mana. So Amplification getting a buff, I think this is the right move. You want to have it so that any proc you receive is something you feel good to press, that you're looking forward to pressing. I think for Arcane this has long been a problem and currently is in BFA. And here's Enlightened, which is the doubling down on staying above certain percentages. This is your ceiling ability for Arcane Mages now in place of Touch of the Magi. What it means is that we'll do 8% more damage if we're above the 70% mana threshold, and then we get a little bit more regeneration if we're below 70%. Actually, it's quite a bit more regeneration, but the point is it rewards players for trying the playstyle which keeps you above that. And I think that's excellent. You want people to have a good payoff, and 8% is good. Maybe it needs a buff. It might need to be a little higher. And I'm not sure if it's really there's Nether Tempest at all can compete with it. We'll see if in these changes here if it can, but excellent. Something I'm glad to see. So Nether Tempest places a Tempest which deals kind of 70% of your spell power over 12 seconds, so it's a dot, and nearby enemies within 10 yards. So previously it was 17% to the primary target and 1% to all nearby enemies, and I think what they're trying to do is rein in the reach of Nether Tempest so it doesn't hit quite as many by nearby, and it's also they're probably hoping to increase the damage to some degree. So it's not 17% to the primary and 1 to the all secondaries. It might be 17% to the primary and maybe like 8, so half of the damage, something like that, which is a little bit more acceptable. Nether Tempest has never felt very good to play with, and that's unfortunate because it offered Arcane Mages a couple of really important things. So I hope that Nether Tempest becomes really good in AoE scenarios and is competitive with Enlightened. One of the reasons I say that is Nether Tempest is a really great go-to spell when you're moving in single target. It is an excellent overtime spell. You can press it anytime you want. It just refreshes the dot. It gives Arcane something to manage that's sort of interesting. And it also has a chance to proc clear casting, which means we can keep our mana high and benefit from mastery by using something like Nether Tempest when we move instead of trying to clear stacks with Arcane Barrage. Overpowered remains unchanged. I think the hope is that it will be balanced a little bit more by the fact that we have a 3-minute cooldown instead of our 1.5-minute cooldown. And I think that's probably a good thing. So those are the major updates, us getting some more information about the details of how these things are working. I think the most significant ones are the change to a 3-minute CD for our main ability, Touch of the Magi going away in place Enlightened, and Touch of the Magi being something to stack together with our damage amps. There's a lot here, to be honest. I think when we move over in a second and look at the different Covenant abilities, we'll see maybe some of the way this is playing out in Blizzard's mind as they move to add value to the mage. And a few I'd like to focus on, really. I think Mirrors is interesting. I don't know if it's really going to do enough damage to warrant it. It is on a 1.5-minute cooldown, so this looks like this damage that comes out at the end, 200% of spell power, is fairly significant, but it's a longer term dot. So I'm not sure if in PvP this is something that people want or if it can get dispelled. But we'll have to see if this 200% damage, in addition to the dot that the mirror places on the target, if it's more significant than something like Radiant Spark. So Radiant Spark causes damage instantly and damage over 8 seconds. So it's damage plus a dot. It has a 1.5 second cast, as does most of these except for Shifting Power. And the most significant part for Arcane is that it increases your damage of your direct damage spells each time you hit. So for 8 seconds, which we can push into our window, the target takes 10% increased damage from your direct damage spell stacking each time they are struck. So imagine we have all of our CDs, we put on Arcane Rune of Power, Arcane Power, we fire up our Touch of the Magi, and then we hit this button, Radiant Spark, and we hit with 4 Arcane Blasts in a row, the last Arcane Blast hitting for 40% increased damage. The one question I have is this little phrase, this effect ends after 4 spells. If it means that the 40% stacks and stays until the 8 seconds is up, so that every cast after 40% just keeps it at 40, or if you hit the 40% mark and then it goes away, so the damage amp from Radiant Spark disappears. Because that's a significant difference for how you would use this as an Arcane Mage. Obviously, if it stays, if the 40% stays, then you want to use this earlier and have the back end of your Arcane Power be filled up with the 40% portion. And if not, then it doesn't matter quite as much, because once you just need to make sure that you've cast 4 spells. But in any case, 40% damage on an Arcane Blast going into Touch of the Magi, multiplied by Overpowered, multiplied by Rune of Power, multiplied by Pot, multiplied by whatever other features that we're going to get for Mage, like a trinket, that kind of thing. This has the potential for quite a few layering pieces, making Radiant Spark very significant, in my opinion, for the single target. In contrast to that, we have the other more significant one, which is Deathborn. Deathborn makes us into a mage for 20 seconds and amplifies our Arcane Blast, obviously also our Frostbolt and Fireball. And what I didn't know from our last video is how this was going to be iterated, and it looks like it's going to be a cleave type approach, so hits up to 2 enemies near your target. So can be a total of 3. So our main spender, our main builder, Arcane Blast, our main damage ability, is now getting cleave if we take Deathborn. This is a 3-minute cooldown, so it also lines up with how Arcane Power is going to work, and it increases our spell damage by 10%, so it also gives us a damage amp. This has the potential to be absolutely bonkers, like over the top bonkers. The reason I say that is because Frostbolt and Fireball contribute far less to the overall damage, though they're a significant part of the core mechanics of Frost and Fire, than Arcane Blast does for Arcane Mages. Imagine stacking together, like we just talked about with Radiant Spark, all of our CDs. If we're taking Overpowered, stacking together Overpowered with that. All of these damage amps suddenly in a cleave scenario. It depends, of course, on what this means by near your target. If it's 10 yards, if it's 15 yards, just like with Carrion, depends on whether this spell effect ends or if it just remains at 40% until the duration is over. But I think Deathborn seems to me to fill the gap for Arcane Mages where they have largely struggled in especially Mythic tier raid encounters, which is in Cleave. So a full AoE setup for Arcane Mages in BFA has actually been reasonable. You can rely on doing a lot of damage with Explosive Echo and Arcane Pressure, which are 2 Azurite traits that amp our AoE damage side if we're hitting 3 or more targets. But we really have nothing significant for Cleave. 2-target Cleave, 3-target Cleave. This kind of thing, especially lining up in 3-minute CD with a 20-second buff, guarantees that we can have Deathborn running for the duration of our damage amp buff. Has the potential to be exceedingly powerful and off the charts explosive for Arcane Mages. I don't know about Fire and Frost. I'm not going to speak to that at this moment, but this one looks like the one I would think about going to. The only caveat I would have is whether Radiant Spark, if this does end up being you get to 40% and then the buff remains with you at 40% until the 8 seconds is over, I could see scenarios where in single target you can double down on that insane amount of damage. So you're just getting a huge amp. But for me, I think Deathborn offers probably the most value for Arcane Mages, seeing as that's where they struggle the most is with Cleave. Shifting Power. The stats on this, which I did not have access to before, it's a 6-second channel. It is 60% of our spell power and nature damage every 2 seconds, so it ticks 3 times. It's an AoE, so it's doing nature damage to everything, and it is cooling down our mage abilities by, I'm not sure what this number represents, by a certain amount every 2 seconds. So there's going to be 3 ticks, both of damage and cooldown reduction. Now, I don't exactly know what this 3,000 out of 1,000 means, but imagine you have a 3-minute cooldown, and maybe it's cut by a third, so it's increasing it by 30% or something, the cooldown of it. Maybe what this is showing is that with Shifting Power, you knock off 10 seconds off of your CDs every time it ticks, so you get 30 seconds off your CD, turning Arcane Power, for example, into a 2.5-minute cooldown. Is that going to be worth it over clear damage amps like Radiant Spark and the potential of having massive cleave in your setup. And I don't think so. Again, I'm not sure. One of the things that makes these things complicated is we likely will not be able to test to the full extent that we'd like which of these covenants we should be taking. So again, the mirrors, the damage on the back end of mirrors seems insane. It's a lot. But I can't see it competing with an amp to Arcane Blast like this, given how many stacking buffs Arcane can already bring to the table in their rotation. Okay, I think that's going to be it for this video. I'm going to continue to try to publish my thoughts as we get more information on our current Arcane Mages going into Shadowlands. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please let me know if you have any questions in the comments. Have a good day.